I think benchmarking can be powerful. Every time you present data, there should be some sort of comparison. I think probably the most powerful one is a trend over time at your own company, because that really tells the story of change and experience, and it holds constant a lot of the things that can be different from one company to another. So I think that's my favorite type of trend or way to benchmark.
Colby Nesbitt leads the people analytics team at Lattice, an HR software company that helps companies drive high performance and engagement. For more than a decade, Colby has used analytics to help organizations hire, assess, develop, and retain their most valuable talent. Prior to joining Lattice, she worked at Twitter and also consulted for organizations across the federal government and military. Colby has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology and has published research on leadership, engagement, and the changing nature of work. Colby, welcome to Voices of HR.
Great to be here, Berta. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are so excited to have you here. And what a background. And what an exciting topic. We were just talking before we pressed the record button, how excited both of us are about this whole topic around data. And I know most people aren't. So we're going to make them excited with this podcast.
We'll change their minds today.
It's a tall order maybe, but we can do it. So this whole notion of data really has been around in the marketing world for years, using it to predict consumer buying behavior, to predict who's going to watch what news channel. I mean, data is incredibly powerful. So that's why we're so excited to talk to you, because now it has entered the HR realm and the HR space. So before we jump into that and how we can help our listeners use data to move their organizations forward, as we had promised at the beginning, can you tell us a little bit about your journey, both to your PhD and then all the way through working with some of the largest organizations and also the federal government, and now you're at Lattice. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I found my way into organizational psychology because it's the intersection between content areas like leadership, engagement, job performance, well-being, diversity, inclusion. And these were all things I was interested in because I was a psychology undergrad. Mm. But I also loved statistics and research methods, not math, but statistics. And IO psychology, as we call it, or industrial organizational psychology, is really the marriage of those two things. Because if you imagine a lot of research in medicine or in other areas of social psychology, you're conducting experiments in a lab. But in order to understand work and leadership and teams and really complex topics, we can't create those experiences in a lab. We need to go out into the real world and measure them. And to do that, you need really great statistics to help you answer those questions. And so that's really how the field came to be and how I found my way to it. The real superpower of IO psychology is being able to take a question or a hunch or an idea, frame it as a hypothesis, and go get the data to challenge that hypothesis, to get the right answer and to point you in the right direction. And so in the last decade or so, we've really seen an explosion of this field in people analytics where businesses are using some of those skills and techniques. And a lot of IOs, you can come into people analytics through a lot of different ways, but a lot of IOs have found their way into this space and found that their skill set is valuable in this way.
Well, I love how you just teed that up with what is the hypothesis, and then you go find the research, right? That's going to give you the answer. I always say with any type of opportunity or problem set or challenge within an organization, and now as it relates to people, it always starts by asking the right question. Mm-hmm. And so what are some of the main questions that we should be asking in HR today that data and analytics can help us figure out?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a huge shift happening right now in HR to be more strategic, more impactful, and more results driven.
Mm-hmm.
And those things are all enabled by data. How can you be more results driven or impact oriented if you don't measure it? And the other thing that's happening at this moment is the data are so much more prevalent. Data is everywhere and about everything. And we don't always know what to do with it. And so you have those two pieces. And if you can bring them together, it's incredibly powerful. So I think the questions that we most want to answer are, what is the true impact of the work we do in HR? How can we demonstrate that? How can we serve the business not just to do HR for the sake of HR, but really to improve business outcomes? How can we create processes that are impactful and fair? And how can we understand our workforce in the deepest way possible to show across the employee journey what experiences at our company are like, so that we know where to intervene where needed and what will move the needle.
And one of those, I guess, starting point places, because as I think about our listeners, some are one person HR shops all the way up to, 100,000, 200,000 employee based firms. So we have a large swath of employees, and data is still powerful regardless of whether you're a one person shop or 200,000 employees. So probably the one place that maybe is common amongst all of those where data is actually really helpful is with employee engagement. I
Mm-hmm.
think most of our audience is probably familiar with NPS, Net Promoter Score, and how that's used as a philosophy really within an organization to identify the predictability of a client, their satisfaction, whether they're going to continue to purchase. But now data, and in your field, you're starting to think about eNPS. Can you tell our audience, what is the intersection with engagement and eNPS? Are they the same thing? Are they different?
That's a great question. I love this conversation. So just to back up for a moment, if not all of our listeners know what the eNPS is, or the NPS, I think they may, but it's a net promoter score, and you have a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is, I would not recommend this product or service at all, and 10 is, I would recommend it wholeheartedly, without reservation, enthusiastically. And most people are somewhere in between, but we do have this scale where you have 0 to 6 is what's called a detractor, where they're not someone who's going to be representing your brand or company enthusiastically to others. Then 7 and 8 are passives, who are sort of neutral. And then you have your 9s and 10s who are promoters. Those are your brand champions, culture champions. And so when you put all that data together, you have a metric on a scale from negative 100, which means that everyone is a detractor, to positive 100, which means that everyone is a promoter. Most companies are somewhere in between. So the metric was first used to ask customers how much they would recommend a product or a service, but it was extrapolated to ask employees how much they would recommend working for their current company as a measure or an indicator of engagement. And the reason why it's so popular, I think, is because it's very simple. Once you understand the calculation, it's very straightforward, and it's very widely used. So it's easy to communicate. It's easy to benchmark. And the eNPS is useful because it's a little bit like telling you the temperature of the room. Are things really going along swimmingly, or are there areas that really need some serious attention? It gives you the temperature. So it's the thermometer, but it's not the thermostat. It doesn't tell you what specifically is going well and what specifically is not going well. And so that's why it's important to have the eNPS accompanied by a robust engagement survey that will allow you to dig into the more vivid experiences that employees are having to better understand what is it that makes them want to recommend it as a place to work or not, and what you can do about it.
All right, so I'm going to play probably some of 50% of the people that are listening right now, and they say, we definitely want the data. We want to understand. We want the temperature of the room. but will employees actually give it to us?
That's a great point. And I think that's the work that happens outside of the survey. I think a lot of folks focus on what questions should I ask? How do I set it up? What's the timing? And those sorts of programmatic questions. But there's a much greater context that's happening around engagement. And really it's a conversation between employees and leaders and HR and everyone at the company that's really encapsulated in this process. And so I think if you're standing up an engagement program for the first time, it's important to set the tone and have an open conversation. If you're able to do that in some sort of open forum or in communications to show this is why we're starting to do this now, and this is why we believe it's important, and here's what we're going to do with it. So I think there's so much that can be gained by having a conversation around why we're having this survey, and that will help improve participation and help people understand how it's being used, how it's confidential, it'll be shared with your managers at an aggregate level, it can be used for action planning. All those pieces help get people on board. And now, if you're already conducting an engagement survey and you have a low response rate, I think that is a little bit of a different situation to address. And so there, I would try to understand, if you can, why people are not responding. Is it because they're simply too busy? Is it because they don't feel safe responding or being honest? Is it because they just don't think that anything is coming from the data? They don't see any impact, so why are they going to bother? So I think there's a few different reasons that you would address a little bit differently for each of those. But it's so critical to get that participation. And I think that's what can be missing from some of the analysis too, because I think it's great to have the data, then we crunch the numbers after the survey is over, but there may not be a feedback loop to the employees. And that's so important to say, this is what we heard from you. And so I think it's really important to have a debrief with the whole company in some fashion after a major engagement survey. That's what's so important in an engagement survey, is to not just let it stop with the analysis, to have leaders saying, this is what we heard from you, here's what we're going to do about it, and here's how we're going to hold ourselves accountable to it. And that really increases the power of the change that can come from an engagement survey.
Yeah, and I think that is such an excellent point. It's, a lot of times in HR, you focus on, okay, how do we go get the data? And then once you get the data, okay, now what is it telling us? There's interpreting the data. But one of the most important parts is, what are you going to do with the data?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes that gets missed. And there has to be, I suspect, a foundation of trust. Because are there organizations where maybe they shouldn't gather eNPS data? They're not ready for it. Is there such a thing?
So I've heard that some folks are hesitant to even collect the data because they're afraid it will be poor.
Mm-hmm.
I would say collect the data anyway, and then show where you've come. Because if you wait until things maybe get a little better, but you won't necessarily know what to work on, A, and then B, you won't be able to measure your success. So I would say start measuring things. But I will say a caveat, and Berta, you bring up a great point about, are you ready? I think my take would be, if there's a specific area that you are not ready to hear feedback about or not ready to action on, then you should not ask that question. So I'll give you an example. We made a decision in our most recent engagement survey to remove a question about benefits, because at the time we were locked into our benefits vendors and all the options for the next 2 years. And we were just about to hire a new head of total rewards. So it didn't make sense to ask that question and then not do anything with the data for 1.5 years, 2 years. It would be disingenuous, and folks would feel that they were not heard. And so we chose to ask that question at a time when it would be something that we could action on and actually make change.
I think that is such an excellent point. So don't ask if you don't want to know. I guess if you aren't going to be actionable about it. And number 2, be very thoughtful about which ones you ask, so that you're gathering the data that you need in order to help your company progress. I guess both of one and the same. Are there certain questions that a majority of employers are asking today? So if I'm sitting there and I have never conducted an eNPS, are there certain topics that are foundational to making this work or not? Or is it just company and situational?
That's a good question. I think, and I'll clarify that this is bigger than eNPS, right? This is an engagement, and it is a fine point, but eNPS is not engagement. So let me dig into that first before we get into some of the other topics.
Let's go there.
So the eNPS, because it's asking, would you recommend this company to someone else? It gives you a little bit of a global signal about someone's sentiment toward the company. And by that, I mean, maybe it relates to how they perceive the strategic direction of the company or the business outlook or the culture overall, or some of those global factors. Now, we know that those are important for engagement, but there are also more local, what you might say, local factors like my experience of my day-to-day work, my manager, my team, but that may not be, if I were to recommend someone else to work at my company, they probably wouldn't have the same manager as me. And so it separates out some of those, the altitude of some of those inputs for your sentiment or engagement. And so what I've seen is that there's a strong correlation, but it's not a perfect correlation. And so it's still important to measure other aspects of what I would call more traditional engagement, which are things like, I am fulfilled by my work, or I'm excited to come to work every day, because that incorporates some other elements of my experience outside of just my recommendation to someone else.
I love that distinction. So let me play this back and make sure that I got it right so that our audience can hear it hopefully correctly one more time. So eNPS and engagement aren't the same thing, but they can and possibly should be used together.
Mm-hmm.
The eNPS is the altitude. How does the individual feel about the company and would they recommend the company? And then the engagement is much more day-to-day questions about how do they feel about their work, or do they have a best friend at work, I think is one of the questions on the NPS or the engagement survey that I think always got the best and the highest attention. So is that correct?
Yes. I think engagement might also include eNPS in terms of that culture. I think that would speak to core engagement as well. But I would say engagement is the umbrella and eNPS is one thing under the umbrella.
Voices of HR audience, you just learned something really, really critical when it comes to data. So thank you, Dr. Nesbitt, for telling us that. All right. So we can also use data to help us, talking about strategic data, using data strategically within your organization, particularly in HR. So let's say, for example, HR has an initiative, a strategic initiative to drive DE&I. How can data help with that?
I think this is a great combination and a great demonstration of how data can be impactful in HR. So in the current environment that we're in, everything needs to be prioritized, and there isn't as much bandwidth to do all of the things. And so we need to show the value of everything we do. And I think in DE&I, that's an area that has not fully capitalized on the value proposition. It's so powerful, and I think we haven't successfully connected it to business outcomes and all of the value that comes from it. And so I think without data, DE&I can feel like a program, like a culture initiative or events or groups, which are all very important, but that can feel a little bit more like a nice to have when you have to make really hard decisions. And when you have data alongside it, you can say not just what is the right thing to do, but what's happening right now. So for example, you can say, your data may show that people are leaving because they don't feel like they belong here, or people are leaving because they don't see themselves represented in management. And that's powerful in a different way than some of the programming and experience related opportunities that the DE&I programming can focus on. And so actually at Lattice, on the people analytics side, because we sit right next to DE&I, then we bring that lens to everything we do. So every time we do an analysis around a people program, or we look at our promotion rates, we look at our performance distributions, we look at pay equity, all of those things have a DE&I lens so that we can assess across the employee journey, are people having equitable experiences? And so that takes a really strategic and data-focused lens in a place where I think perception and anecdotes can easily dominate the narrative. And so there's power in being able to say, this is what is, and this is what we know.
I think you just hit the nail on the head when it comes to DE&I. We recently had Mita Malik, who is the author of Reimagine Inclusion, here on the podcast. And she was talking about the business case, that the business case hasn't changed with DE&I, but yet we talked about how like 30% of CEOs are starting to decrease funding for DE&I within their organization. So the problem hasn't changed. It's just the way that they're approaching it has changed. And you just made an incredibly excellent point, which is data can help you go back to the business case.
Mm-hmm.
So don't abandon DE&I because there's still a reason for it. Use data to help you determine whether it's being powerful and if it's doing what it's supposed to do within your own organization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think something that I read recently was that around this deprioritization of some of those efforts, and that may be common across businesses, but the evidence does not show that it's less important to employees and candidates. So I think that's part of the data you might seek in determining how you resource around that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that one. Gen Z expects it within their organizations. So, and now they have tools such as, are you familiar with, there's a site called Comparably that actually compares how employees think about, that has an eNPS score out there. It has, it breaks it up, the score upon departments and different groups, diversity, women, people of color. And so whether that data is correct or not, or whatever, that data is now available to the public. So if you're thinking about joining a particular organization, you can go check that out now.
Mm-hmm. I haven't heard of that, but I'll have to check it out.
So, I mean, data is being used to influence a lot of whether people are going to think about coming to your company, staying at your company. Data is powerful.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
where I've seen,
go ahead.
A place where I've seen this be really powerful is in creating action planning. So we have one department at our company that started initiating DEI action plans, and the other departments are going to follow, where they made commitments to say, we are going to be transparent about these areas. We are going to be transparent about our pay equity and our promotion rates across groups. And they said that at the beginning of the year, and then they hold to that. And that increases the trust that that's something that is, it isn't happening behind a curtain. It's happening in where employees can see the results of the actions that are being taken.
I love that. Good for them. Good for them. So for small to medium-sized businesses, what advice would you give them to start leveraging HR analytics? Is there, like, take them all the way back to the very beginning? Would you just have them start with eNPS and not the other questions? Would you say ask eNPS plus 5 questions? Give us a starting point.
I would start with a set of questions, maybe 20 to 40, depending on the appetite. I would include eNPS, but I would include other topics that are important. And there are a lot of resources out there of just great questions to include. But here's a little bit of how we approach our survey and how you can think to model after a little bit, maybe. So you have eNPS, you have core engagement, which is the ultimate criterion. The ultimate measurement that you're trying to make is to understand people's engagement. And then you have all of the different experiences that relate to those things. And as you're selecting questions, you may be thinking about what sort of information you're getting out of that, which is great. But also be conscious that the questions you ask will tell employees what you think is important. The questions you ask on an engagement survey will tell employees what you think is important. And so if you ask 20 questions about their productivity or how committed they are, and only one question about their manager, then that says something about how you're thinking about their experience. And so I'm not saying that any of those questions are good or bad, but you show the real estate says something. And so at Lattice, we spend a good chunk of the survey measuring core engagement really well, because we want to make sure that we understand the full experience that employees are having. And then we also ask a number of questions about manager behavior and capability. There are other ways we get at this in training programs and other data we collect about our managers, but we know that by asking these questions in our engagement survey, we are signaling, hey, managers, this is what's expected of you. And we're signaling to employees, this is what we're holding managers accountable for. And we've chosen in a time of change, in a time of uncertainty, to really enable and invest in that enablement of our managers to guide employees through change. And so that also gives us signal on how that investment is paying off. And then we also have a lot of questions about, or a solid number of questions, I would say, about team environment, about senior leadership, about workload and capacity, about alignment and prioritization, about wellness and benefits at the right time, as I mentioned. And that collection of topics allows us to ask the question, not just what has the lowest scores and the highest scores on the survey, and that's what we're going to pay attention to, but truly what has the strongest relationship with engagement? What's driving engagement, and how can we turn our attention to those things that are really going to have the greatest impact?
So let me ask you, so I have a lot of follow-up questions because you just gave us gold there, pure gold. So we just recently had Christophe Martel on, and his company helps reduce friction within organizations. Are there any particular questions that you can think of, and I'm making you do this off the top of your head, any questions that could get to the heart of friction?
Can you define that a little bit more for
So
me?
more like productivity, more things that are getting in the way of people doing their jobs. And so it's less about interpersonal relationships and much more about things that could be controlled within an individual's environment that's creating friction and decreasing productivity.
I really like that orientation. We have focused quite a bit on cross-functional partnerships because that's been really key in the phase of the business that we're in. So we ask about cross-functional partnership. We ask about collaboration across locations because we're a remote first company, and 40%, over 40% of our employees are not near an office hub. But I think we could do a better job, to your point, about measuring the barriers to productivity to understand those better.
Yeah. And I don't think a lot of individuals can articulate it. They know it's frustrating for them, but until they're asked specific questions or until the company signals that this is important by asking the question, sometimes it just gets glossed over. And I think a lot of his research showed that individuals will leave organizations because they get so frustrated because they have no control over the things that are impacting them personally within their daily work lives. So let me take you back to a couple of questions, follow-up questions. So core engagement. Can you define that for us?
Sure. This is bringing me back to graduate school where we studied engagement as a construct and read all the studies about it. And so core engagement, you can think of it as a state and as something more enduring. So I can feel engaged in a moment, in a task, and then I can also feel engaged over the course of several months in my work. So there's a couple different time horizons or ways to think about it there. But I think most people think about it as the more enduring, how am I feeling throughout a few months about my work? And it really is an affective, so it has an emotional component, it has a cognitive component, experience of your work and a fulfillment in your job. And I think something that I draw a lot from is the research on this topic, which tells us the most important things that predict engagement. And something I think that can be lost too is it's great to have really specific data from your company. That's great because you know what pockets of the company things may be looking a certain way or what in groups of employees. But our company isn't on Mars. We're all operating with humans, and humans are motivated by the same sorts of things. And so it's not as though we're reinventing the wheel every time, right? Good managers are good managers, even in different industries, different companies. And so I think there's a lot we can borrow from just general best practices, general knowledge, and research. And so what we find is some of the most significant predictors of engagement are task variety, task significance, autonomy, feedback, manager effectiveness, inclusion. And so let's unpack those a little bit. Task variety, that just means, are you doing the same thing over and over every day, or are you doing a lot of different things? And why is that important? Well, task variety allows employees to learn. It keeps them from being bored, and it gives them opportunities to grow. And that is going to increase your engagement because you have more creativity and more variety in your work. And it's great for organizations because then you have skill growth. Everyone's talking about skill growth these days. You have greater perspective across different functions. Maybe if someone has done different tasks, they don't just do the same thing. They realize, oh, there's a connection with this process that's happening over here that we can make easier. And you make it less siloed so that not one person is the only person who knows how to do that process. So there's benefits on both sides. And then task significance, that just means, do you think your work is meaningful? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, someone might be on a manufacturing line screwing widgets onto a thing. And that may be a repetitive task, not a lot of task variety there. But if they're screwing widgets onto a piece of equipment that's taking someone to space, then that changes the significance. And so sometimes it's just a reframing. It's not even changing the work at all. It's just a reframing of, here's what your work is enabling. And I think in HR especially, we can lose sight of that because we may not have our hands on the product. We may not be talking with customers every day. And so as managers, I think that's part of our responsibility, is tying the everyday tasks that may not seem that significant, that may feel a little bit removed from some of the business outcomes, to those really key outcomes, where maybe, say you're in talent acquisition. Well, you're not just conducting recruiter screens, you're not just closing out recs, you are finding the people who are building the product and finding the best people who can make the best product, finding the best people who can be the best face to our customers. And that's so much more meaningful than just, okay, I'm going to show up to this meeting. And so that's some of it. And I think the other piece around autonomy is something I find is really important during times of change. It reminds me a little bit of some work that some colleagues of mine did at Lattice using our customer data on eNPS. And actually, they looked at eNPS trends over time and saw that over the past year and a half, and the eNPS score across many thousands, tens of thousands of customers has gone down, especially in the tech industry and in a time of uncertainty and given the market conditions. That's not terribly surprising, but it was striking to see. And what I think is interesting about engagement is what I've seen in the literature and in my practical experience is change does not automatically mean that engagement will fall. If people feel that if they have agency and autonomy, if they're a part of the change rather than a victim of change, you can maintain very high engagement through uncertainty and through leaner times. It doesn't mean, and you notice none of the predictors or the drivers that I mentioned was promotions or compensation. And not that those aren't important, but a lot of other things are. And so it doesn't mean that growth is on pause if you're in leaner times.
I love all of that. And it makes me think back to a company called Vanguard. I think now they maybe manage $8 trillion in people's dollars. They all own the organization. It's a mutual fund company. And in times when the market is turning, is in a downturn like 2008, they redeploy a lot of their people on the phones. Regular people, the CEO could be on the phone. And engagement goes through the roof, even though the markets are crashing, because there's purpose, there's meaning in talking to people every day and helping them understand exactly what's happening with their money. And so I always think about when you just said that about engagement, it doesn't have to go down just because there's change or because there's challenges in the workplace or in the marketplace. Absolutely love that point. What are some disengagement questions that should be asked? What are some things that create disengagement that HR should want to know about?
Yeah, the way that I think about drivers of engagement is not necessarily positive drivers and negative drivers or causes of disengagement, but more generally, does this concept have a relationship with engagement? And what that tells you is folks who tend to have a positive experience on that dimension, say it's your team environment. If you have a really positive team environment, then your engagement will be high on average. And if you have a really negative experience of a toxic team, it will be low. And so I think those pieces get to both the things that raise engagement and the things that lower engagement. I think that I'm still thinking about the friction point you brought up. I think that would be a great area to ask about sources of disengagement, because we do ask a question about removing barriers to productivity and being able to get things done. And that's a question that you can really get a flavor in the comments for how frustrating it is to feel like your work isn't moving forward. So maybe you're working really hard and you have a good team environment and you have a lot of great things going for you. But if you somehow can't break through and you're working so hard just to stay on the hamster wheel, then that's an incredibly frustrating experience. And so that can get at some of those experiences. I think other really important factors, actually something really interesting we found, we looked at the drivers of engagement by using a statistical model that included all of the concepts in our engagement survey and asked, taking all of these things into account, what are the strongest drivers of engagement? And something that we found was not in that top list was manager effectiveness and team cohesion. And I really paused when I saw that. And here's why. At our company, at that point in time that we asked the survey, and this is actually something we've seen consistently, the ratings were almost universally high for folks really loving their teams, loving their managers, which is wonderful to see. And because of that wasn't giving us any signal about someone's engagement, because almost everyone said, no, I love my manager, they're doing great. And so I was very careful in how I interpreted those results to our leaders to say, that is not to say that these things are not important, because I can tell you for sure, if we see those fall, engagement will also fall. But I think those, when you think about the distribution of experiences, that is something you could see, that those things are not always going to be tied to the outcome if you don't have a lot of range in the experiences there.
So be careful when you interpret the data to make sure that you're interpreting it correctly. And then that also leads me then to another question around comparing data, either within your industry or with other organizations, maybe your competitors. Is there a reason to do that?
I think benchmarking can be powerful because it gives you almost, actually, this is a great rule for data, regardless of whether it's engagement data or any data. Every time you present data, there should be some sort of comparison, whether that's an external benchmark, whether that's a trend over time, or a difference from some sort of stated goal. Maybe you want 100% participation, or maybe you want to be at 20% of something. Everything should have a frame of reference. Otherwise, you can put a chart up on a screen and you say, that looks great. What does that mean? Is that good? Is it bad? And so I think there's a lot of power in choosing a benchmark or a referent, but you have to choose carefully. So I think it is wise to benchmark against like companies in terms of maturity, size, industry. I think that makes a lot of sense. You could use a couple different benchmarks to show some more of those different lenses. But I think probably the most powerful one is a trend over time at your own company, because that really tells the story of change and experience, and it holds constant a lot of the things that can be different from one company to another. So I think that's my favorite type of trend or way to benchmark.
Yeah. And I always say, the start to strategy, and, most organizations don't execute their strategies as flawlessly as they could or should. And therefore, they aren't seeing the impact to the bottom line. And I love what you just said about take the data and compare it back to what your goals are. So if you don't have anything else to compare it to, and you're a small organization, compare it to where you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a good starting point. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a sense that data or HR analytics is only for certain companies, or only for companies of a certain size or stage, and that's just not true. Right. And so I think about maturity in this way. We talk about there's a what, there's a so what, and there's a now what. And those are, you can think of them a little bit on a continuum of where you're able to go with your own data. And so sometimes if you're a small company, you might be calculating attrition for the very first time. And maybe leaders don't know what that number is, or they don't know what that number is in their part of the business. And again, that's a place where perceptions can run rampant. And so there is power in just saying, this is what we have measured and this is what we know. And so that may be groundbreaking.
All right. So to unfortunately wrap up this part of our conversation before we get to rapid fire questions, where do you think this field is going?
I think the people analytics field is pretty young. To be honest, it has roots in IO psychology, which developed over the 20th century, but really it's only in the last 10 to 15 years that this area has exploded. And so there's so much that has changed just in that amount of time. And I think the number one thing is the tools and technology that are emerging in this space related to data access, related to AI. And I think that those tools and technology will really democratize the data access and analysis that people are able to do. So it used to be that you basically had to be a data scientist to even access the data, put it together, and get any meaning out of it. That's becoming so much easier. And what it does is it doesn't make it less important, right? It makes it so the emphasis is more on data literacy, strong research design, and interpretation. And so that's really important, because there's no amount of fancy analytics that can save you from bad data.
Absolutely. We'll wrap it up with this. I'm sure our audience is sitting there saying, okay, what questions? I'm bought in. Okay, you got me excited about data. What questions should I ask? And so we'll give you some links in the bottom here that will help direct you. There is also a book from Fred Reichheld titled The Ultimate Question, which is NPS. And then I believe there's also an eNPS book out there as well. So we will put those links below. So we are wrapping this up, but before we let you go, are you willing to play rapid fire questions? So these are 1-sentence questions with 1-sentence answers.
I might be have a hard time keeping it to 1 sentence, but let's do it.
All right, let's try it anyway. All right. What are bad recommendations you hear in HR being passed off as best practices?
This is a spicy one. I think everyone's really excited about the possibilities of AI, as am I. I see it used and passed off as best practice in some ways in the recruiting space that I think hasn't been fully balanced with some of the implications and the laws.
If you could have your own billboard that would reach millions of people, what would your message be?
Seek first to understand before you seek to be understood. That is advice I got from in marriage, pre-marriage counseling, but it served me at work as much as in my personal life.
What underrated tools are indispensable for your job?
I don't know if this is underrated, but I don't know what I would do without Slack. It makes it so much easier to get things done quickly. I couldn't ever go back to just email.
Isn't it wonderful? It really is. What company or companies do you study as best practices in HR for company culture?
That's a great one. I think I'll take a people analytics lens because that's where I'm sitting. But I think Dropbox is one where I see really thoughtful work coming out where they publish research about their remote strategy, how they approach solving problems, and they just are really thoughtful and transparent about those things. I think HubSpot is another one. They put out a DEI report that's really fantastic, and I think could be a model for others in the field.
What is one book that has greatly influenced your life or your career?
So hard to choose. I would say Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's his experience having been in a concentration camp, and then he became a psychologist, and his philosophy about the meaning of life is finding purpose.
Where can people go to learn more about you and Lattice?
You can find more about me on LinkedIn, and we'll share some links for Lattice. I think there's some really great resources that could be of interest to our listeners today. We have Resources for Humans, which is a Slack channel open to all HR professionals. It has well over 20,000 users where folks can come for connection and information and questions. And there's so much that Lattice can offer to our listeners.
That's incredible. Today, we have been joined by Colby Nesbitt, Head of People Analytics at Lattice. Thank you again for joining me, Colby. It has been such a pleasure.
Likewise, Britta. Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.